listening to Your Secret is Safe with Me, non-judgmental talk about infidelity with Dr. Marie Murphy. If you're looking for new perspectives on complicated relationship issues, you've come to the right place.
Days go by, they're crawling by.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Marie Murphy. I'm a relationship coach, and I help people who are engaging in anything they think counts as infidelity to deal with their feelings, clarify what they want, and make decisions about what they're going to do. No shame, no blame, and no judgments. There are many benefits to working with me, including finding relief from all of the intense and exhausting emotions you may be feeling, and learning to think about your situation in a way that helps you see where you have power and choices, and resolving your situation in a way that's truly right for you. There's a lot of prescriptive advice out there about how to deal with an infidelity situation, and a lot of it basically says that if you're the one cheating, you better stop it right now. But that's not my approach. My perspective is that there are many ways to resolve an infidelity situation, and your job is to find the resolution that's right for you, and I can help you do that. So when you're ready to talk, you can schedule an introductory coaching session with me through my website, mariemurphyphd.com. You can learn more about the coaching packages I currently offer through the services page of my website, mariemurphyphd.com/services. And let me mention that as this episode airs in late October, 2022 will be on its way to its conclusion. And my availability between then and the end of the year is limited and filling up. So if you've been thinking about booking your first session with me and you want to get started, I encourage you to find yourself a time on my calendar before I'm all booked up for the rest of the year. Okay, as the title of today's episode might suggest, we are going to talk about how being a human feels fucking terrible sometimes. And this applies to everyone, infidelity or no infidelity, but it certainly is important to keep this in mind if you're grappling with an infidelity situation and feeling, shall we say, rather challenged by it. I think that we as a society don't acknowledge how awful it can feel to be human to the extent that we usefully could. And I don't think we acknowledge all of the various flavors of what feeling terrible can feel like to the extent that we usefully could. We don't talk about all the different ways to feel awful. And we don't just fail to acknowledge that being a human feels terrible sometimes. Even worse, we suggest in many ways that feeling terrible is a sign that something is very, very wrong. Maybe it's a sign that there's something very wrong with us, or a sign that there's something very wrong with someone else, or with our life circumstances, or with the whole entire universe. I think that these kinds of messages and these ways of thinking do us all a tremendous disservice. And today I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about other ways we might conceptualize and approach the experience of being humans who are probably going to feel terrible sometimes. My observation is that in general, we collectively accept that we aren't going to feel amazing and great all of the time. Or at least we say we accept this. We may recognize that there are going to be times in life that are pretty tough, and that entail some emotions that we don't consider positive or pleasant. But we also have this collective sense that there's only a certain amount of discomfort that's acceptable. We might embrace the idea that a certain amount of quote unquote negative emotion is normal or at least unavoidable. And we might agree that these particular types of so-called negative emotions are pretty much unavoidable too. But we think that there's some sort of threshold beyond which we shouldn't have to feel pain or discomfort of any kind. We might think that it's okay to feel terrible for 5 minutes, or maybe an hour, maybe even a day or two, but not for a week, and definitely not for a month, and definitely not for longer than a month. And there's also this idea floating around that even if it's okay, kind of, to not feel great sometimes, it is far, far better to feel good than to not feel good. Nod your head if any of this sounds familiar to you. And by the way, if this sounds familiar, and if this has been your way of thinking about so-called negative emotions or uncomfortable emotions, there's nothing wrong with you. I thought about my own uncomfortable emotions in exactly this way for quite a long time, so please be assured that I'm not calling you out if you've been thinking about emotional discomfort or feeling fucking terrible in this way. This way of thinking about emotional discomfort is very prevalent in our world today, and that's why we all are so likely to believe this stuff. And I'm speaking primarily about the United States because that's my frame of reference, but these ideas certainly aren't exclusive to the United States. One of the reasons these kinds of ideas about quote unquote negative emotions have become dominant in the United States and beyond, not the only reason, but one that it's helpful to be aware of, has to do with the cultural authority of the medical profession. Medical knowledge has a particular degree of esteem and legitimacy in our society, and this came to be true through particular social and historical circumstances, which I will not get into the details of because I am no longer a card-carrying sociologist, and this is not a sociology lecture or even a sociology podcast. Thank goodness. So no deep dive into the sociology of medicine and medical knowledge today. Suffice it to say that medical knowledge has come to be seen as more legitimate than other forms of knowledge in our society. And this has been the case for so long that we pretty much take it for granted these days. One of the things that the medical profession has done is medicalize conditions and behaviors or aspects of the human experience that weren't previously conceptualized in medical terms or attended to with medical solutions. And we as a society have come to see aspects of the human experience as intelligible primarily or even exclusively through a medical lens, and have come to agree that medical solutions are the best or only ways of treating or responding to those aspects of the human experience. And there are two general things that I want to say about medicalization. The first is that this process applies to many aspects of the human experience, such as childbirth, baldness, premenstrual syndrome, erectile dysfunction, and emotions. And that's what we're primarily concerned with today, of course, although back when I used to teach undergraduate sociology, I did love talking about Viagra and the medicalization of impotence. We'll get there another time, perhaps. The second general thing for today that I want you to know about medicalization is that it isn't inherently a good or a bad thing. Medical sociologists argue that some people have found great relief from the medicalization of their conditions. Big examples of this are chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. Many folks who suffer from these conditions have found a lot of relief from having their experiences deemed legitimate, or at least more legitimate, by the medical profession. In a world where medical knowledge has such great cultural authority and legal power, having a medical diagnosis may be the difference between being taken seriously and getting healthcare and being dismissed or worse by healthcare providers and by anyone or everyone else. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's better on the whole for a condition to be medicalized, but it may have some distinct benefits, especially to individuals who suffer from a particular condition. On the other hand, sociologists also argue that medicalization has led to disease mongering and the pathologizing of normal aspects of human experience. And many would argue that emotions, including the so-called negative emotions, and including intensely negative emotions, are a normal part of the human experience that has been pathologized within the medical profession. And then, of course, the pharmaceutical industry has made a killing off of this. These days, we may take it for granted that if you're too sad, you're depressed and possibly need medication. And if you experience more than a certain amount of anxiety, you have an anxiety disorder and perhaps need medication. But it wasn't always this way. Now, I want to be really clear that this is not a rant against medical knowledge writ large or pharmaceutical assistance for dealing with emotions. That's not what I'm getting at here. My opinion is that there are a lot of different tools out there to help us get through life. And if you find pharmaceutical tools helpful to you, fantastic. If you like the results you get from using medication to help manage your emotions, that's wonderful. And moreover, it's none of my business. But whether you find medication useful in managing your emotional experiences or not, I want to suggest that we collectively may lose a lot when we think of emotions as experiences that need to be viewed as pathological and need to be managed primarily or exclusively with medical tools. Whether or not you find benefit in medication, there is tremendous benefit to be found in A, normalizing the experience of feeling pretty fucking terrible at times, and B, learning how to deal with feeling terrible with tools other than or in addition to medical tools or pharmaceutical tools. In contrast to medical perspectives on human emotion, which tend to valorize a certain set of emotions and pathologize another set of emotions, perspectives from literature and religion and philosophy and life coaching emphasize that the breadth of the so-called normal, quote unquote, human experience includes some emotions that feel great and some emotions that feel pretty fucking terrible. These other perspectives acknowledge the place of agony as well as ecstasy, the place of boredom and malaise as well as contentment. They recognize that anxiety may be just as normal, if you will, as excitement. Great thinkers have recognized that heartbreak and heartache and devastation are just as fundamental to the human experience as joy and elation and love. In other words, there are many perspectives on so-called negative emotion that suggest that these so-called negative emotions don't have to be a problem. Here are a few comments on emotions we tend to consider negative. In The Prophet, Khalil Gibran writes, "Your pain is the breaking of the shell that uncloses your understanding. Even as the stone of the fruit must break so that its heart may stand in the sun, so must you know pain. And could you keep your heart in wonder at the daily miracles of your life, your pain would not seem less wondrous than your joy. And you would accept the seasons of your heart, even as you have always accepted the seasons that pass over your fields. And you would watch with serenity through the winters of your grief. Much of your pain is self-chosen. It is the bitter potion by which the physician within you heals your sick self. Therefore, trust the physician and drink his remedy in silence and tranquility. For his hand, though heavy and hard, is guided by the tender hand of the unseen. And the cup he brings, though it may burn your lips, has been fashioned of the clay which the potter has moistened with his own sacred tears." As is completely obvious, that passage gets me every time. I read that for the first time shortly after I had graduated from high school on a lunch break from my part-time job at a retail establishment I prefer not to name, and I remember just crying buckets. And it still happens every time. And for me anyway, what that speaks to is the value of these words. On a different note, in Love and Rage, The Path of Liberation Through Anger, Lama Rod Owens writes, My anger is like a living being that I am in partnership with. My anger has been precious to me ever since I realized that, like any other person or thing, it too deserved to be loved. Before this realization, my anger was sad and lonely. It felt forgotten and ignored. It acted out like anyone who has felt ignored or taken for granted acts out. I started practicing loving my anger because I wanted to be liberated from it. Loving my anger means that I allow it to be there without judgment and without shame. Moreover, loving my anger disrupts its power over me and allows space for me to be in power over my anger. Quite succinctly, Henry Rollins tells us, "Believe me when I tell you, life will not break your heart, it will crush it." That's from a song called Blues Jam, I think, which was on a Rollins Band album that came out in the 90s, but I cannot remember the name of the album to save my life. And I don't want to look it up because it was a pretty bad album, if memory serves me well, even if that line stuck with me forever, which it certainly did. The Egyptian Book of the Dead tells us that to live is to die 1,000 deaths. And we can interpret that line in many ways, but one way is that we may feel excruciating emotional pain that feels like death over and over again. And we may then be reborn over and over and over again. Jim Carrey, as in the actor, was interviewed in Details magazine back when Details magazine A still existed and B was actually cool back in 1994. I was a teenager then, and like any self-respecting, slightly punk rock teenager, I was very into magazines and zines, if you remember those. And for a while, I had a library-worthy magazine collection. It was quite impressive, if I do say so myself. In the digital age, it's kind of amazing and weird to look back on that. But at the time, having insane stacks of magazines was actually pretty cool. Anyway, I liked my magazines so much that I actually saved a handful of them even after I got rid of most of them when I moved out of my parents' house and moved from place to place. But then I became, over the years, even more ruthless about holding on to stuff just for nostalgia's sake, and I got rid of what was left of my magazine collection. It was down to just a few at that point, I assure you. Except for this one issue of Details with Jim Carrey on the cover, which I still have to this day. The reason I kept it is because in this interview, Jim Carrey said something that struck my teenage self as really important to pay attention to. And it's something that my 40-something self still thinks is pretty important to pay attention to. And I'll read that to you now. I have been through times when I'm literally squatting in the living room, having one of those open throat cries when you're crying all the way to your butthole, Carrey said. I always believed I would come out of it, though. I don't think anybody is interesting until they've had the shit kicked out of them. The pain is there for a reason. A lot of those times when I was in those depressions, I've also had the thing going through my head that this is what I've asked for. I've prayed to God that I would have depth as an artist and I would have things to say. I've said, no matter what, keep me sane, but give me what I need. Okay, I could keep reading passages about the value or beauty of our intense and uncomfortable emotions or our intensely uncomfortable emotions all day, but I'm going to switch gears slightly and share a nugget of insight from each of the life coaching schools from which I received my training as a coach. My approach to coaching is informed by a lot more than just my coach training per se, but I have actually been certified and trained as a life coach by the Life Coach School and by Martha Beck's program, which is now called like the Wayfinder Coach Training or something like that. But back when I took her training, I think it was just called the Martha Beck Institute. Anyway, Martha Beck is still the head person. Anyway, Brooke Castillo, who is the head coach or head teacher, head guru of the Life Coach School, teaches that life is 50-50. And what she means by that is, even if we are really dedicated to managing our minds and consistently cleaning up the thoughts that create unnecessary suffering for us, we're still going to experience negative, quote unquote, emotions 50% of the time. Some of these negative emotions may be mild, and others may be extremely intense, right? We may be talking about a little bit of irritation or frustration or just some boredom or annoyance, or we may be talking about agony, grief, hatred, rage, fear, etc. The important message here is that the point of living our lives consciously and intentionally is not to eliminate all uncomfortable emotion. Even if we deliberately create lives we love, we set and accomplish goals, and we have great relationships, and we do whatever else we most want to do, we're never going to get to a place where negative emotions aren't part of our experience. There are many reasons for this, one being that our minds are in existence to evaluate the world around us. And unless we can start to decide that everything around us is great, which is pretty unlikely, we are going to have negative feelings based on our thoughts about things. And what if that's okay? Now, I personally don't love to say that life is 50-50 because I'm just not a quantitative person, and putting it in those terms doesn't really appeal to me. I prefer to say things like, it's totally normal and okay to feel really awful sometimes, right? But I share this phrasing of hers with you because so many people find it really powerful. The idea that it's inevitable that even living our so-called best life entails feeling uncomfortable emotions half the time is a really mind-blowing insight for some people. So whether that phrasing appeals to you or not, it's one way of normalizing the spectrum of emotions that humans experience, right? It's one way of suggesting that maybe the point of our lives is not to eliminate uncomfortable emotion entirely. Along similar lines, one of the mottos of Martha Beck and her coaching community is, "This is way harder than I thought it was going to be, and that's okay." The Martha Beck people apply that mantra specifically to the process of making change. Martha talks about how we may set off upon the journey of change making, thinking maybe that it won't be hard or maybe that it will be hard, but only so hard. And then once we actually get into it, we discover that making change is excruciatingly hard and uncomfortable, far worse than we imagined it would be. And the point there is, what if that's okay? I think this motto or mantra can actually be applied to life in general, not just moments in life in which we're making change. I like to rephrase this one and say, what if this, meaning life, is way more uncomfortable than I thought it was going to be? And what if that's okay? Now, just to be really clear, the point isn't that feeling happiness and joy and all of the emotions that we really like to feel isn't wonderful. Of course it is. And nor is it the point that we want to create excruciatingly uncomfortable feelings for ourselves on purpose or not do anything proactive about experiencing an excess of discomfort or a superabundance of discomfort. I am all in favor of reducing unnecessary suffering. But in order to do that most effectively, we have to be intellectually willing to contend with some discomfort, perhaps discomfort 50% of the time. And B, we have to be willing to actively feel our most unpleasant feelings instead of trying to resist them. Ever heard the saying, what you resist persists? I think that's attributed to good old Carl Jung, but I bet Buddha said it first. It's also worth emphasizing that some people say that without contrast in emotions, we would never get to fully experience the emotions we love to feel. If we couldn't experience sadness, we wouldn't get to experience joy. If we couldn't experience despair, we wouldn't get to know hope. I have definitely observed in myself and in my clients that when we try to avoid intensely uncomfortable emotions, we often end up cutting ourselves off from experiencing intensely pleasurable or enjoyable ones too. If we want the fullest extent of the awesomeness of the human experience, we have to be open to the fullest extent of the unpleasantness of the human experience. The way that we think about our feelings sets the tone for how we are actually able to deal with our feelings. If we think that uncomfortable emotions are a problem, we're going to deal with them very differently than if we think of them as a normal part of life or as part of the richness of the human experience. So although our intellectual framing of our emotions is but one part of the process of learning how to deal with being a human who may feel fucking terrible at times, it's a very important part of the process. And I would suggest that it's usually the start of the process. From there, the specific practices we can engage in to learn how to tolerate and embrace our emotions becomes a lot more possible. So with that in mind, with the importance of how we think about our emotions or what we think about our emotions in mind, I'll share one last way of thinking about emotions that may be helpful. I have been talking about emotions as being similar to weather for a while now. So I was particularly delighted upon listening to Jamie Raskin's memoir, Unthinkable: Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of American Democracy, that a friend of his counseled him to do the same in the wake of his son's suicide. The way I think about weather and emotions is this: weather just happens. It's part of the experience of life on Earth. It's a force of nature. And although we may like some varieties or forms of weather better than others, it all happens whether we like it or not. We can navigate our way through it, but we can't control it. We can make the experience of our least favorite forms of weather less bad by being willing to tolerate them with neutrality. We may never love rain, but we don't have to actively cultivate hatred for it either. And weather, like emotions, creates a particular physical experience in our bodies as it occurs. Heat feels physically different from cold for us. Being in the snow feels different from being in the rain. Anger feels different from sadness in our bodies. Elation feels different from contentment. But feelings, like weather, are just things that happen. They're forces of nature. We can learn how to work with them, but we can't make them go away. And what Jamie Raskin's friend told him is that we don't have to take our feelings personally. Just like we don't take weather personally, we don't have to take our emotions personally. And I thought that was so brilliant. We are experiencing some form of weather in our lives in this moment, just like everyone else on the planet is. And we are having some kind of an emotional experience in this moment, just like everyone else on the planet is, right? It may be helpful to think of our emotions as happening through us rather than to us. Just like weather is happening around us, but it isn't happening to us per se. Sometimes we think that this kind of framing of our emotions, or this way of thinking about our emotions, is only available to people who aren't feeling as bad as we are. But I want to suggest that if this framing can be helpful for someone whose beloved son recently committed suicide, meaning Jamie Raskin, it's available for your use too. Sometimes we think that certain events or even certain possibilities are by definition harder to bear than others. But number one, I don't agree with this. Whether something is a big deal to us or not is a matter of our individual thinking. Some things that others might not care much about can matter tremendously to us, and of course, vice versa. And number two, however, if you do think that some events are objectively worse or harder to bear than others, I'd say that the death of your child by suicide might rank pretty high on that list. No matter how intensely we feel our sorrow or despair or fear or anger or shame or panic or all of the above or whatever, we have the opportunity to decide what we make these feelings mean and how we relate to them. We can choose to turn them into problems or roadblocks, or we can choose to view them as part of the human experience we can tolerate and even learn how to make friends with. And I can teach you how to practice doing this, but being willing to try is the first step. One of the most common things that I see with my clients is that they allow intense, uncomfortable emotions to become an indication that they shouldn't do a particular thing. And don't worry, this is not unique to the people who happen to work with me. I do this too. I certainly do it less than I used to, and I'm a lot more aware of it when I'm doing this than I used to be. And I'm a lot more willing to gently guide myself from avoiding my emotions to allowing my emotions than I used to be. And I didn't get to this point because there's anything special about me. I got to this point because I was willing to think about my emotions in a new way and willing to practice allowing them. And then I actually practiced allowing them. And I still practice allowing them over and over and over again, all day, every day, until I stop breathing. So if you're feeling totally overwhelmed by uncomfortable emotions associated with your infidelity situation, or any other situation in your life for that matter, I want to encourage you to see those emotions as part of the richness of being alive. I want to encourage you to see them as something other than problems or indications that something is wrong or indications that you should or shouldn't do something. Yes, you may also want to clean up the thinking that may be creating unnecessary suffering. And you may want to learn how to relate to your emotions differently as they are happening so that they don't give you so much trouble. And I can help you do those things. But the point for now is that we don't have to make our discomfort any worse by thinking that there is something wrong if we're experiencing it. All right, people. Thank you so much for listening. If you are ready to address your infidelity situation in an intentional way, let's work together. You can schedule an introductory coaching session with me through my website, mariemurphyphd.com. I offer confidential, compassionate coaching via Zoom so we can work together no matter where you're located. Have an awesome week, everyone. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to Your Secret is Safe with Me with Dr. Marie Murphy. Make sure to click subscribe to get updates on our latest episodes.